Now, just for the listeners, I actually rotated on a forensic psychiatry rotation in med school, so I'm familiar. But maybe for people who aren't familiar, what maybe could you elaborate on what forensic psychiatry entails?
Yes. So forensic psychiatry is the interface of psychiatry and the law. And it sort of it's kind of in a broad stroke, I would say that there's sort of two different divisions kind of within forensic psychiatry. So there's a civil division that often has more to do with like workman's comp cases or insurance claims, disability claims, whether people have the capacity to execute a will. So that's called testamentary capacity. So there is a big civil piece, and then there's more of a criminal piece. And I think that's what people think about when they think about forensic psychiatry, or they see somebody on Law and Order who's testifying as the psychiatrist. And those, the criminal side then would be, it would include treatment of inmates within a correctional setting. It would include competency to stand trial reports. So that's a here and now evaluation of an individual or a defendant, whether they have the capacity to understand the nature and objectives of like the legal proceedings against them, and to assist counsel in their defense, so that we don't take anybody to court or put them on trial who doesn't understand really the proceedings and what's going on. The other report that we commonly do would be not guilty by reason of insanity. Those are people at the time of the crime really didn't understand what they were doing essentially is wrong. So there is a big criminal side to it. Some of us, most forensic psychiatrists, or I shouldn't say, but a lot of forensic psychiatrists think that criminal part is the more interesting part. Why people do what they do, methods to sort of protect the mentally ill who have committed a crime but don't really understand what they're doing. And then those individuals, at least within, it's usually state by state, but in Ohio, if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, then you are often sentenced, not sentenced, but you're sent on like a commitment to the state psychiatric hospital. And there's lots of safeguards before those individuals are released from the state sort of mental health system. And it probably varies state by state. Obviously, I'm in Ohio because that's where I live and am very familiar with what we do here, but it could be a little different in other states. But it's not that people just walk out of jail once they're adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity. They usually are sent to a hospital, and then there's usually several people who have to agree to move them to a less restrictive environment, like a 24-hour supervised group home.
Gotcha. Yeah. And would part of that also entail, like, do you testify in court frequently for that, or is that kind of a separate thing?
So you can. So on the civil side, you can be called in on any of things like malpractice would also be something that I would consider a forensic psychiatry specialist. So we sort of also would look at malpractice suits, both from the defense side as well as from the plaintiff side. And you could be called in to testify on pretty much any case you work on. Oftentimes, the two parties, the prosecutor and the defense attorney, will agree and stipulate to the report. In other words, they'll just accept the report that you've submitted. If there's questions or concerns, they can definitely call you in to testify in really any case that you've done.
Gotcha. Okay. And is that a year-long fellowship that typically that people would do for that? Okay.
Yeah, it's 1 year.
Interesting. And is most of that inpatient work, or is there an outpatient component to that as well?
So forensics would mostly, I guess you would consider it more outpatient, because, or there are forensic psychiatrists who, for example, work in the state psychiatric hospital. So if the judge decides that the defendant is not competent to stand trial, based on the report that they're going to get either, and it's not always a psychiatrist, sometimes it's a psychologist who also sort of authors these reports. But if the judge makes that determination, looks at our report, agrees with what we've opined in terms of the opinion, and have decided that they're not competent, they'll go to the state hospital for something called competency restoration. So they will get both mental health treatment, and as well as they'll go to classes where they learn sort of pretty basic things, but a lot of things about courtroom procedures, make sure that they understand if they're offered a plea bargain, what that means, that they're making rational and logical choices when they're given plea bargain options. So there's a lot of forensic psychiatrists who then work within, like, as on the inpatient unit on like a competency restoration unit. And so those would be forensic psychiatrists as well. Most of the court reports, the competency to stand trial not guilty by reason of insanity being the most common ones, those we usually work in something called ours is a court psychiatric clinic, but most places have what they call a forensic center or a court clinic, where the inmates or the defendants are brought over for the evaluation. So in Cuyahoga County, the inmates are brought over to the offices, which are housed in the same building, for us to evaluate them. In Summit County, there's a group that actually goes to the jail that does those evaluations. So it's a little different, probably county by county, depending on how big the county is and, what kind of volume they have. But most places will have a court clinic. We can also do evaluations in that setting. In bigger counties, they're going to have a mental health court. So they're going to have a subset of the judges who are specially trained to understand mental health issues and intellectual disabilities, and how that might be not the factor, but a factor in the charges that the individual has. So there are judges who are specially trained. And so we'll sometimes do an evaluation about eligibility for transfer to the mental health docket, which means they're going to get one of those judges who has special training in that area.
Gotcha. Now forgive me if this question seems trivial, but there's kind of a lot of craze in the media these days of, these shows where you show like FBI profilers or people that, profile criminals psychologically or anything. Is that something that a forensic psychiatrist would participate in, or is that something more like a clinical psychologist or someone in law enforcement would be more involved with?
We do not necessarily have special training in profiling criminals. And so that probably falls more like within the FBI. I know they have special behavioral individuals who just sort of study those kinds of things and try to work up profiles. But I would not, at least in our fellowship, that was not anything that we specifically looked at.
Gotcha. Interesting. It's really fascinating, that intersection of, like you said, the legal system, using your medical training, and then kind of it's very different than kind of what I think some other kind of the mainstream focus of medicine, which is pretty cool. Is this what you do 100% of the time, or if not, how do you devote, what other areas of psychiatry do you work in, or have you worked in the past?
So I would say it is definitely not 100% of what I do. I would say that the information that you learned during that fellowship, lawyers are very careful with their words. So I think it's made me much more careful when I write clinical notes about the words that I'm using and how that might be interpreted differently by different people. So I think that that's helpful. I have a few private cases. So every once in a while, somebody will reach out. You can, accept those cases or say no to those, depending on how busy you are. At the moment, I have very many private cases. I'm pretty busy sort of doing what I do most of the time. I spend a half a day at the court psychiatric clinic in Cuyahoga County. And that definitely relates directly to the fellowship. And then I spend 2.5 days treating inmates in a jail. And so I work in Summit County Jail, but that also, and that's not doing special evaluations, that's just treatment, because they are confined and they can't go out to see their psychiatrist or be evaluated. Then we'll see them for treatment. Some of them, depending on how severely ill they are, if they're extremely psychotic and they're really not eating, not drinking, too disorganized to sort of manage, we can also send them we have to have the judge agree, but we can send them to the state psychiatric hospital on like a civil admission, just like anybody else would go. They wouldn't be a forensic person there for competency restoration or a not guilty by reason of insanity acquittee, but they would go just as a civil admission. And then when they're improved and they're treated, then they'll send them back to the jail and then they can go to court.
Gotcha.
They tend to not stay as long in a civil admission. So I think what most people are going to see during medical school is our average length of stay is of 5 to 7 days. But to be restored to competency, those people, you're limited about the charges. So you can't have stolen $5 and end up being in the state psychiatric hospital for 3 years for competency.
Right.
People are going to be unrestorable. So depending on, what level of a crime it is, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, depends on how long you can actually keep them in the state psychiatric hospital. So, but typically to go for competency restoration, it's going to be a longer inpatient hospitalization than what you would normally see during medical school.